thank you so much for joining us. And as mentioned, my name is Max, and today I'm joined by Wesley Loh. Wesley, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, I'm Wesley. I graduated from the Nanyang Technological University, NTU for short, with a Bachelor of Degree in Accountancy in 2017. Today I work in the corporate income tax line in a commercial firm. I'm autistic and I'm an autism advocate, as you can see in my background, for around 5 years and counting. Yeah, my story has appeared on various media platforms such as the Purple Parade Stories website and the Enabling Guide website. And to date, I have written 11 forum letters to the Straits Times. So just go and Google search Wesley Loh Straits Times forum. You will find a few of my letters. And I also co-run autistic-led chat groups on Telegram and on WhatsApp.
Great, thank you so much, Wesley. So yeah, let's get started. So today we're here to discuss the UNCRPD and why it matters. Why should we, what is it, and why should we care about it? So before we get into the why part of it, let's start first a little bit. I'm just going to briefly talk about what is the UNCRPD. So the UNCRPD stands for the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it is essentially the product of it essentially defines what disability rights are. So over many years, mainly in the 1990s, early 2000s, many advocates around the world, they had this dialogue. They said we really need to encapsulate what disability rights are. And after years of dialogue, and this is the end result, was this UN document called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that really defines what is disability rights and outlines internationally agreed standards on how best to protect disability rights. And many countries have ratified the CRPD. Singapore has ratified the CRPD in 2013. And so what does it mean when a country ratifies the CRPD, right? What does it mean when a country like Singapore ratifies the CRPD? So basically what it means that once a country ratifies the CRPD, every several years, usually 4 or 5 years, the committee from the United Nations, known as the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they meet up with representatives from that country's government, and they have a really in-depth conversation about where things are in that country regarding disability rights. And the committee also meets with civil society groups and activists and advocates as well. And after all these meetings, they write a final report called the Concluding Observations, and basically outlines like, okay, here's where things are with disability rights in the country, and here's how things can be improved. Here's our recommendations how they can be improved. And about 4 or 5 years later, they meet again and discuss, okay, what has been done over the last 4 or 5 years, and the cycle repeats basically. So Singapore met, as mentioned, ratified the CRPD in 2013, and met for the first time with the committee in earlier this year. The representatives from the Singapore government met with the committee in the UN for about 2 days and had a really in-depth discussion. As mentioned, the committee also meets with civil society groups and advocates, such as DPA. So DPA, we had the opportunity of presenting our parallel report that we authored earlier this year, and it's published on our website. And Wesley was there, also had the chance to present a report as well. And yeah, it was a really refreshing time of honest dialogue. And as mentioned, the government met with them for 2 days. And DPA, we summarized the 2 days of sessions into a document that is on our website as well. But we are going to have a webinar next month that goes more in depth about what was said during the 2 days of sessions, and goes deeper into these issues of that the CRPD covers, and I'll talk more about it later. So that's in general what the CRPD is. So it's this document that the UN uses to help countries in improving disability rights in their respective countries. That's essentially what the CRPD is. And so now that we kind of clear, what is it? Why does it matter? Why is it important? What difference will it make, right? And for that, I'd like to, turn to you, Wesley, to ask your opinion. But before I get your opinion on how the the CRPD, benefits you as an advocate here in Singapore. Maybe you could tell me a bit more about your advocacy work.
Okay, sorry for the glitch because I muted myself and I realized that
No
the
problem.
host has disabled the unmuting, so I couldn't unmute myself. So I'll leave myself unmuted from here on. Okay, so my latest advocacy work is okay. Sorry, I'll rewind a bit. Before that, my advocacy work I did advocacy through a few different platforms or channels. Like I have given talks to university students or talks in other platforms. I have participated in focus group discussions, and I mentioned just now I've written forum letters. But my latest advocacy is actually the insurance discrimination issue. So many autistics have been facing discrimination from insurance companies, where a lot of us either get outright rejections, meaning our application gets rejected, or even worse, our application doesn't even get assessed at all. And some of us get blanket exclusions on mental health. So simply put, even if you only have 2 or 3 mental health conditions, they exclude all mental health under the sun. And exorbitant premiums through loading fees. And for some, they even have accounted both exclusions and loading fees. So it's a double whammy. And a lot of times this is unfair. Some of the insurers have even shamelessly said that the reason for the rejection is autism, and that is very unacceptable. It is against the CRPD principles, which we will touch on later. And of course, my latest advocacy was actually this CRPD process itself, where I was involved in writing a written submission under the Autistic Minority International banner, which is an international autistic organization, because Singapore doesn't have any autistic-led organizations to date. So we had to write it under the banner of an international organization. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums up some of my latest advocacy work.
Great, thank you so much, Wesley, for sharing. It's very important for us to know. So yeah, let's get to the question of, as you mentioned, you participated in the CRPD process by writing a report, and you had a chance to present it to the committee. How has being part of this process, you think, helped you as an advocate here in Singapore?
Well, first I get my voice heard, because in the process of writing the written submission, it gives me the opportunity to reflect on the landscape of the autism community in Singapore, so that in my written submission, I can write about what's the current landscape, what are the gaps, what are the issues faced. And when it goes into the written submission, my hope is that the CRPD committee will actually raise these pointers to the government and raise the issues and the recommendations, and that through that dialogue session, the government will really seriously consider the recommendations that I put forth in their policy making. And I also get other autistic voices to be heard, because I surveyed some of them to find out what is their view of the situation here in Singapore, and I get their views into the written submission. So in that sense, I become representing the autistic community. So I don't just speak for myself, but I speak for my autistic friends. And when the CRPD puts the recommendations in their concluding observations, it can also be used for accountability for the government, where we can actually ask the government sometime down the road, okay, what is the status of the observations? What have you implemented? What's the progress like? And yeah, accountability is very important, because things need to be in check. And in the course of interacting with the president of the Autistic Minority International, when we were putting together this written submission, I also get to learn about the autism community landscape in the international space, as well as to hear what are the international autistic advocates' views on certain things or certain issues, which I otherwise may have missed out or been not aware of. So it was a learning process for me as well, to do in the process of having this written submission. And of course, I'm blessed to have, the president of Autistic Minority International, who is autistic himself, to actually give some guidance and pointers. Yeah.
That's great, and there's a lot of good points there I want to unpack as well. But I guess before we get there, you shared about some things that you learned through working with Autistic Minority International. Maybe could you share, maybe just 1 or 2 examples of some of the things that you learned?
Well, one of the things I learned was about SPED schools. SPED stands for Special Education. which includes autism-focused schools or other schools that are focused on whether autism, intellectual disability, or some other disability, where all the students there are all have that particular disability. And one thing I learned was that the UNCRPD actually does not advocate for SPED schools, which is something new that I learned. I never knew that, even though I heard of the CRPD a few years ago. And more importantly, what I learned was the spirit behind it, which is the spirit behind it of why they don't stand for SPED schools. It's not because they are against SPED schools per se, but it's because they want, or their ultimate goal is to have integration in the mainstream schools, where the disabled students can be integrated into the mainstream schools and the mainstream schools be made disability friendly so that they have equal access to education. The keyword here is equal access. So that was the a new thing that I learned, and it was insightful. Because otherwise before that I was actually quite pro about SPED schools, because I had a hard time in mainstream. And the other thing I learned was institutionalization, meaning when you put all the autistics in a big home, like let's say hundreds of them in one home, or even small group homes are actually considered institutionalizations by the UNCRPD's definition. And institutionalizations is something that I also found out that is something that the CRPD doesn't advocate for. And I was actually less aware or even unaware of this situation until I heard from the president of Autistic Minority International in the course of doing this written submission that many of the international autistics who went through institutionalization actually had a very hard time or traumatic time in the homes. And more importantly, it's not so. Again, just like the education example, the more important thing is to learn why and the spirit behind why the CRPD doesn't advocate for something, right? And the reason behind it is because they are trying to aim for countries to enable independent living of autistics or of persons with disabilities, and to enable them to live in the community instead of being isolated in one place, isolated and separated from the rest of the humans or the community. So yeah, so when that was shared with me, and I started reading some accounts of people who had traumatic experiences, I was like, wow, this is so totally new to me,
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think it really, and that's, I think, a real aim of the CRPD, right, is to really broaden our perspectives, to really inform us of experiences, not just in our countries, but around the world, so we can learn from other places as well, and to inform us to be better advocates as well, And I really like what you said about how, forgetting at the spirit of the convention, right? Because a lot of times people sometimes I feel they have this misconception about the UN and the CRPD and these conventions, and they think like, oh, it's so strict and they're against this and against that. It's not really about that. It's more about the purposes of inclusion, of dignity, of equity, equal opportunities, pursuing those things, right? Not so much of what the CRPD is against, right? And I feel you articulated that quite well. I also really like how you said earlier, about how the concluding observations, serves as a reference point, and how you felt that your voice is heard through the 2 days, through not just presenting, but through the 2 days of dialogues as well. I'm just would like to ask, was there something that caught your attention during the 2 days of dialogues in particular?
Yes, I actually liked it that on the second day, many of the UNCRPD committee members actually asked a number of questions on the insurance discrimination. So that really made me feel like, because I was working so hard on this, pushing for this issue, or to pushing for inclusive insurance for autistics. And when I've been at this for so long, when I see that, hey, the CRPD has asked so many questions, it really felt like my work has come to fruition. I mean, not that the problem is solved or anything, but at least there's fruits of my labor, and I'm also very glad that the CRPD committee emphasized that there needs to be laws and not just guidelines, because the Singapore government kept telling the CRPD committee, when the CRPD committee asked them what they've been doing about the issue, they keep saying that we are going to pass guidelines for the industry to follow. But the CRPD did say that written observations that it has to be a law. And I think that's important because guidelines, as the term suggests, is not enforced. It's just a guideline. And insurers can easily work around the guidelines by coming out with endless excuses of why they want to reject an autistic or why they want to make exclusions or whatever the underwriting outcome may be. And they can work around the guidelines and try to maintain the status quo. So that is the reason why there needs to be laws. Yeah, but I don't know why at this point, the government hasn't spoken about passing laws. They just keep talking about guidelines. And actually, Senior Minister Taman, in his parliamentary response, and by the way, this parliamentary response was published publicly on the MAS website, right? So yeah, it's public information. He actually said that insurers should not turn away disabled people based on the disability per se. While that is a good start, but it would have made a lot more impact if he had actually called out the insurer's failure to practice these guidelines. This principle. And by using vague terms like should not turn away based on disability and fair principles in insurance, it barely scratches the surface, right? Because it is very vague and it's not defined well with, and it doesn't have it doesn't have proper and concrete guidelines, criteria and boundaries of what is fair principles. And when they should or should not turn away disabled people or disabled people's insurance applications. So without all these clear boundaries, it's very easy for insurers to get around, right? So I really think that the government needs to step up their efforts in actually dealing with this issue and being stricter with the insurance companies and penalizing them for being black sheep in our community, and as the committee has said, make it into a law. And the other reason why laws is important is because laws will also reflect Singapore's stand on non-discrimination and ensure proper and effective compliance of the CRPD principles and the requirements. Guidelines do not reflect the spirit of the CRPD.
Well, thank you for sharing all that. Thank you for sharing all that, Wesley. And I want to broaden it out a little bit, right? Because I think you shared about why there should be guidelines, why there should be penalties for these insurers when they do discriminate, when they do go against the spirit of the convention. I think more importantly, like it touches on, I think all this, right? It really touches on, and it really gets to the heart of the question that we're here to discuss today, right? Which is why does the UNCRPD matters, right? And I want to kind of end with a couple of thoughts on why onto this question. Firstly, to what you've said, I think this CRPD and the whole process, it really serves as a forum and a platform where these honest conversations can happen, right? Where these honest conversations about where what still needs to be improved, what still is lacking in the system, different viewpoints on and suggestions of how to improve disability rights in Singapore. Can be openly debated and discussed, without fear of getting rejected or without getting any fear of rejections. And for example, if I could share just briefly about some of the work that we at DPA do, one of the things that I've been really focused in on and DPAs are focusing on the last year is something that was announced in this past year, was something that was announced in 2021, where the Prime Minister talked about this going to be an upcoming workplace anti-discrimination law. And so we at DPA have been quite active in trying to have conversations with policymakers to make sure that there are that the law can be optimized and as best possible, right? The law can be that will be effective in addressing instances of discrimination, right? Disabled people and other groups face. And in fact, today we just wrote that was published today in Channel News Asia touches on this topic. So I was really glad that that issue was an issue that was openly dialogued and debated on during both days of meetings between the government and the UNCRPD committee, right? So for example, I remember the first day, the representatives from the government talked quite a bit about equality and how, the Singapore Constitution outlines equality and non-discrimination. But then the CRPD committee replied by saying that, no, there needs to be, from our surveys, of work in this area, there needs to be accompanying legislation that is prioritizes inclusion and accessibility for disabled people. I thought that was a very important conversation that happened. That one of many important conversations that occurred during the 2 days of sessions. And as mentioned, we at DPA will be having a webinar in January that I'll talk about a little bit more towards the end. But finally, I want to end on something that you touched on and something I also briefly alluded to, which is that the CRPD committee, CRPD, and this entire process, right? It really serves as a reference point, right? As a check-in, because they had these dialogues with the government, they had these dialogues with us as advocates, and then they wrote these concluding observations. And so it really was a reference point, really a check-in that lays it all out, right? Here's where we are right now in terms of the state of disability inclusion in Singapore. Now, how can we improve? Now, how can we get better? How can we be more inclusive? How can we strengthen protections for disabled people and the rights of disabled people? And having that strong check-in, a strong additional check-in to give us this point of reference so that we can keep making progress. To me, that gets at the heart of answering why the UNCRPD matters.